all the feels on this one.
Because that's what the science says.
Welcome to The Whole View. I'm Stacey Toth of Real Everything. I'm all about loving the skin you're in and being healthy inside and out.
Let's talk about what this looks like in real life.
Facts do not have opinions.
And I'm Dr. Sarah Ballantyne of thepaleomom.com. I believe that scientific literacy is the key to improving public health.
Just don't let perfection be the enemy of the good.
Science is true whether or not you believe in it.
Self-love is really about self-respect and acceptance. Welcome back to The Whole View, episode 467, whereby we actually know what numbers shows are. I don't know if you noticed, listeners, but for the last few episodes, because we weren't sure where the Cloud 10 launch and exciting news was going to go, when it was going to happen, all that kind of stuff, we've just been numberless for a while, but we are now officially back on track, and I want to thank everyone for their positive support and feedback and encouragement about how exciting it is that we have an opportunity to reach more people. And I haven't heard a single person be like, commercials. Like, you are such amazing people that you understand the importance of how incredible opportunity it is to reach more people and for us to have a show that is supported. Not just like for the past 9 years, us as in this little bubble, but that we're kind of trying to elevate and reach more people, and your willingness to participate as a community in that process is wonderful, and we're very grateful for it.
I can't believe how many people I've already heard from who have listened to our podcast for the first time. Like, they're probably their second episode if they didn't start going back in the feed. And that, I just want to say, like, welcome. We're so happy to have you. That is so exciting to me to already be seeing the ability to reach more people with our witty, science grounded, what's it that we do here? Something like that. Witty science puns,
Banter.
Maybe
information. Maybe information sometimes. Like today, dear listeners, where we have 11 pages of notes.
We better get into it because this is going to be a doozy. So this week's episode is driven by Grace's question. And Grace wrote, "Dear Stacey and Sarah, I'm a longtime fan of your amazing podcast and both of your blogs, and took the AIP lecture series a couple of years ago and learned so much. I've listened to the whole series at least 3 times, and your voices have become like part of my brain now. I feel so much attachment to both of you, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate the contributions you've made to my life."
This is the part where I say, "Oh, Grace, I'm so sorry." But also, what a wonderful, nice way to start. I'm like, okay, whatever you need, Grace. Whatever you need, we're in.
I love the idea. I'm like both like a little bit disconcerted, but also like super in love of the idea of somebody hearing our voices as they're making decisions. Like, it's like, what would Sarah and Stacey do?
We're definitely on opposite shoulders, though. Let's be really clear.
That's super true. All right. So you're going to listen to the Stacey shoulder or the Sarah shoulder? That's the trick. All right. Grace continues. "My problem is sugar. I follow a maintenance AIP and my meals are great. All veggies and seafood and healthy starchy veggies and working on organ meats. But I have this one kind of ridiculous habit that I haven't shaken. Namely, I have always been a sugar lunatic. In my 20s, I drank 1 million Diet Cokes a day and ate just hordes of candy. And over the years, I have tried to stop eating sugar a number of times, but find it so hard. Even during the elimination phase of AIP, I struggled. I would eat Powerballs and have spoonfuls of honey from the jar. Now I'm eating healthier than ever and have for years, but I eat sugar almost every evening. Honey and tea, dark chocolate, some paleo treats. And if my kids have candy around, I find it so hard not to eat. I know it is not rational to eat AIP except candy of all things. Anyway, I'm hoping you might be up for a new sugar show. I feel like maybe I just need to really get why sugar is so bad. I was wondering if you could update on how sugar does affect the microbiome, inflammation. I'm hoping that maybe I can get some info that I can hang my hat on. Love and appreciate you both so much, Grace.
Part of this new change is you're going to hear us give some actual commercials, what is formally called ad copy in the business. And here's a couple of commercials with things you might have heard us talk about before. Stacy Toth here, your resident regulation expert. My favorite non-toxic personal care brand is, wait for it, based in science. I love that Beautycounter tests skincare 8 times and makeup 9 times for safety and performance against 23 human health endpoints, including heavy metals, hormone disruptors, and contaminants like carcinogens. We've talked about what we discover in products after they're on the market, like lead, benzene, PFAS, and asbestos. In my personal care, no thanks. I want to use a brand of products that tests every single batch for safety.
I do love science. And I personally have tried the overnight resurfacing peel and the sunscreen from Beautycounter. I love them both. And I also really appreciate that Beautycounter is committed to the earth. It's so cool that they're a certified B Corp working to zero carbon footprint with entirely recycled or recyclable packaging.
Absolutely. Though none of that really matters if a product doesn't work. I remember your reaction to how well the peel worked the first time that you tried it. That's what made me want to partner with them. I've seen fantastic results personally, changing my skin quality, reducing inflammation, reversing the signs of aging, and just generally being a way for me to feel good in the skin I'm in. But honestly, I love even more seeing you be happy too. If you have rosacea, eczema, dermatitis, KP, acne, I'm not a medical professional, so I can't give medical advice. But what I can do is tell you what's worked for many people that I've worked with, including my own family, the science of why that might be, and my tips and recommendations, both with products and lifestyle. I offer free consultations. Just email me, stacy@realeverything.com, or grab my favorites, check out realeverything.com/beautycounter, and use code CLEANFORALL20 for 20% off your first order. If you choose to shop in one of their stores, Denver, New York City, or LA, or at beautycounter.com, I appreciate you choosing Stacy Toth as your consultant at checkout. And then I can send you a thank you. No, it's not Columbia House situation, no commitments or auto shipment, just a regular online shop like anything else. And if you aren't sure what you want, I'm happy to send a sample. Listen, I'm not only the Beautycounter fan club president, but I'm also a client. Are you sure that you didn't really write Grace's question so that you could have this talk with me? Because I feel like that might be what happened.
Actually, I think that's a wonderful place to start, because I think, Stacy, you and I both have a history of disordered eating, including binge eating disorder, and both you and I sort of ride the sugar roller coaster. So I want to start by telling Grace, like, I super relate to this challenge. Like, I super relate to how addictive sugar is, and how much of a struggle it can be to not let a little bit kind of spiral out of control into a snowball of badness.
And I think I want to add on to that, which I wholeheartedly agree with, to also say that this is the ubiquitous reminder that if that is something that you are struggling with, and I use that word with hesitation because if you're not struggling, then I don't want you to feel like you should be struggling, because that's not the goal. But if it is something that you feel like you're also on this roller coaster, there's nothing to feel like guilt or shame about. This is the reminder that we do the best that we can with the tools and the resources and the knowledge that we have. And sometimes, for me, it's almost always started by stress or by menstruation. And then it's a matter of like needing to figure out ultimately how to get back on the wagon that I want to be on. Not because society says or blah, 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 blah. But we're going to talk about the science, and I know that that science is happening. And therefore, I want to make decisions out of respect for myself and my body and how I want to feel. And those are the things that I want to kind of have resonating and reminding us as we walk through this, because I think it's really easy as we walk through things to demonize. And I think, Sarah, I don't want to speak for you, but I know that we both come from this diet culture that we talked about last week. And we don't want to be those people that are like, you know, one spoonful of sugar instead of making the medicine go down is going to ruin your health. Like, that's that's not where we're coming from.
We're actually intentionally going to talk about how that's absolutely not true, and that sugar in moderation can absolutely fit into a healthy diet. So we're actually even going to talk about the science behind why that like all or nothing mentality is not even correct.
100%. But until we get there, we're going to walk through some science that's like, sugar can be badness. And you've probably heard even us say years and years ago on this show, really extreme statements like it can be as addictive as, well, I don't want to go down that path because I know we've got family listeners, but I think the intention is understanding that whatever we're going to talk about, whatever you're going to hear, someone can frame something in extremes no matter what. And, you've heard us talk about on the show different kinds of things like that work for us or that don't work for us. But even within the confines of this isn't something I consume every day, I might still enjoy it because it's for my mental health or because, it doesn't completely derail me. Sugar is one of those things, right? And so we need to work within the confines of what works for us and giving ourselves grace that even if something isn't working for us, that it's okay to work through how to get on a track you want to be on. And you're not going to forever stay on that track. Sometimes things are going to happen and you're going to need to get yourself back on. And that's just the way it is. I personally think, and I'm sure, Sarah, you're going to get into some of this, that it's because of our background. It's because of my gut microbiome. It's because of the history that I've had for so long before I started prioritizing, as Grace did, vegetables and fish and, all these kinds of things that like, that's my body's go-to. It's its coping mechanism for stress. This is another thing that I've realized, right? Is that over time and trauma and stress, this was something that I went to that created a chemical reaction to help alleviate some of the feelings I was having. And knowing that is super helpful for me, but it's not helpful for me to have guilt about that's what I do. That's what I'm trying to say, is that if we're going to guilt ourselves and stress out about it, it's only going to make things worse. So I want to take that from you, whatever baggage you're carrying. Let me take it off your back and I'm going to set it over here for a minute. And then we're going to talk about science.
I am so just nodding away, emphatically agreeing with everything that you're saying. I also want to point not just Grace, but everyone listening to some relevant previous shows we've done. So we actually talked about consuming real sugars instead of sugar substitutes. We kind of did a summary of that in a fairly recent show, episode 459. And I want to, emphasize that as we're talking about the issues with sugar in excess and where sugar in moderation can fit into a healthy diet, that sugar substitutes just are not a good trade. And we've already covered that on the show. 459 is the place to start. And we've also talked about the role of moderate carbohydrate intake and insulin quite a few times on the show. Definitely places to start are episode 365, where we looked at the links with low carb diets that were actually high fiber and how those still caused undesirable changes to the gut microbiome. Episode 329, where we talked about the link between carb intolerance and gut health. Episode 305, where we talked about insulin as a super hormone and why eating so low carbohydrate that we don't secrete much insulin can be just as problematic as being insulin resistant. And episode 437, where we talked about the concept of nutrivore and what that looks like in terms of the whole diet. That's going to be sort of thematic again today. So I want to start answering Grace's question by talking about how high sugar intake is harmful to the health. What are the mechanisms behind that? And it basically, the root of that comes from a process called cellular respiration. So when we consume carbohydrates, most carbohydrates break down to glucose when we digest them, and sugars are short carbohydrates. They're either 1 or 2 sugar molecules big compared to starches, which can be hundreds of sugar molecules long. So they are digested really quickly, absorbed really quickly, and the glucose contained within can have a really rapid impact on our blood sugar levels. Insulin is then secreted by our pancreas that helps shuttle that glucose into our cells, and then that glucose is fed into what's called the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle to be converted into the molecule that's actually the energy currency for all cells. So it's the molecule that actually drives any chemical reaction that needs an energy input in order to happen. So some chemical reactions, you just put chemicals together and they react with each other and you get a different chemical at the end. Some chemical reactions, especially the controlled ones that happen in our cells, these are sort of broadly categorized as biological processes. They're controlled by enzymes typically, and that is a process that requires energy. So that energy molecule is called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. The process of converting glucose, or there's other sugars that can be used once they've been converted into the right precursors. Fats can be used in this process. But when we make ATP, that process uses oxygen and produces carbon dioxide. That's why it's called cellular respiration. And one of the byproducts of cellular respiration is the production of what are called reactive oxygen species, or they're also called oxidants, or they're also called free radicals. Those are all different names for basically the same chemical class. So these are highly reactive molecules that contain oxygen. So they oxidize things. And oxidative damage is inflammatory. It drives aging. And if we have an excess in these reactive oxygen species being produced, then that's when we start to get all of these different signals for driving inflammation, activating the immune system. Actually, fun fact, our immune system uses reactive oxygen species as part of one of the ways that it can defend us against pathogens. That's a very controlled system. When we consume food, we produce reactive oxygen species. That just happens no matter what we eat. It's something called postprandial oxidative stress or postprandial inflammation, the word postprandial meaning after eating. It is just a thing that is a side effect of being a complex multicellular form of life that requires oxygen. And so, in that sense, just eating is inflammatory, right? All foods cause this production of oxidants. But what's interesting is that there are certain dietary patterns or eating patterns that increase the production of these oxygen radicals. So overeating in general, it's the biggest driver of the excess production of oxidants. But the other thing is high carbohydrate, especially refined carbohydrates. So those are carbohydrates that are super easy to digest and break down into glucose really quickly, and that includes sugars. So basically, the more glucose we consume, especially if we're consuming it in the context of not very much fiber or protein or fat to help slow down that digestion and absorption into the body, the more oxidants are produced, the more inflammation we have every time we eat. And on top of all that, there's a really important context, which is insulin sensitivity. So this happens in everybody. So perfectly healthy people will have this, slight tick up in inflammation every time we eat, but it's very exaggerated in people with insulin resistance. So that would be something like metabolic syndrome or type 2 diabetes, or often other indicators of increased cardiovascular disease risk will also fall under this insulin resistant sort of category. And that's what's really interesting is it's completely proportional. So the more insulin resistant you are, the more inflammation you'll have every time you eat, and the more exaggerated that will be when consuming simple sugars and refined carbohydrates because of the blood sugar sort of spiking aspect of that in the context of insulin not working properly to shuttle those sugars into cells. I really think it's important to emphasize here that we've got a lot to go through, so we don't have time to go through this in detail. But studies have really shown that insulin sensitivity is actually more closely related to lifestyle than diet. So there's this sort of misnomer that you make yourself insulin resistant by eating tons of sugar. That doesn't help, but actually the things that are driving insulin resistance are more like high stress, sedentary lifestyle, inadequate sleep. I wrote a detailed article about this that we can link to in our show notes. And obviously, if our listeners want us to dive deep into this, we can cover it on a future show. But I think it's sort of important in the context of talking about sugar as inflammatory and being more inflammatory in the context of insulin resistance to make sure that we're not oversimplifying insulin sensitivity as being related to that sugar intake.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. And as a listener, I would like to request a follow-up. But I do think that I also want to point out the obvious here, which is that we have many sleep shows. We have all these other things that we've talked about. When you're lacking sleep, you crave more sugar, right? So these things are not independent of one another. And I think I hear so many people quick to demonize the food and just give up the food, but not address the lifestyle factors. And I know for me personally, that's when the food will come back if I'm not addressing the root cause. And I'm just really glad that you kind of pointed to that, because I think if it's happening to me, I'm not the only one, right? So,
right. No, for sure.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think it's super important. And I know how important it is to both of us to kind of dispel and bust those myths. And I do think that it's something we've tangentially talked about in a lot of different shows, but is worth diving in deeper. But let's finish laying the groundwork first, right?
For sure. Yeah. So there's more context than just insulin sensitivity in terms of how glucose consumption can drive inflammation. So we also consume a ton of different nutrients that are antioxidants. Certain vitamins, most phytonutrients are antioxidants. We also have antioxidant enzymes. Those tend to be mineral-based, so we're for short of those specific minerals or the amino acids that are really important to make those enzymes. We might not make enough of those really important antioxidant enzymes like superoxide dismutase. And so depending on our sort of antioxidative capacity, how much tolerance we have for glucose consumption can shift. So the problem really becomes when the balance is out of whack. So we're consuming more glucose and producing more oxidants than we have the ability to it's called scavenging through antioxidants. So the term scavenging is when an antioxidant can basically neutralize an oxidant before it has the capacity to damage something within a cell. So that's another important context, is that, within sort of Grace's diet, eating tons of vegetables, she's going to be eating tons of phytonutrients, which are antioxidants, and that's going to give her an advantage when it comes to sugar consumption. So that's also really important to emphasize. And interestingly, sort of the last piece of this puzzle, and this really also kind of brings us back to why sugar substitutes are not a great idea, in addition to their impact on gut health and hormones, depending on which sugar substitute you're talking about, is that insulin itself is inflammatory. So it's not just the oxidants that are produced by cellular respiration when we consume excess sugar, but it's that release of insulin that goes along with it. So this has been measured in some really clever ways, where they've infused sugar and insulin in different proportions into healthy people, and then measured the inflammatory response in response to something that causes inflammation, like lipopolysaccharide, also called endotoxin, which is a toxin in the cell wall of gram-negative bacteria like E. coli. And also there's an exaggerated stress response that happens with this as well. So having too much insulin drives the stress response, and also drives inflammation. So that whole system really wants to be regulated. And it's helpful to kind of emphasize here that this is the body is really well adapted to moderate carbohydrate intake and modest sugar intake. All of these things start to fall apart when that starts to increase, right? So it's high sugar intake is the problem here, not a healthy sort of carbohydrate intake that includes some sugars.
I think what's interesting for me is I feel like I'm having a little of a breakthrough and understanding of this stuff. And I mean, I've been reading and learning about this for 11 and a half years since, I mean, you've been doing it longer than that because you went to college, wah, wah, wah. I went to college too, but I was writing research papers on, TVs and movies. So it's a little different for me, but I I don't know. I think my brain is kind of finally wrapping around these ideas of, I mean, we did that insulin show as being like insulin can be good for you. And I think even as I was listening, I was kind of like diet culture stuck in my head, but it's gonna kill you. And now I'm understanding, no, without it, like you have major problems. That's why type 1 diabetics need insulin, right? Like
Mhm.
you actually need it. It's a good thing for you. But that too much can be overwhelming. And there's a lot of different things in our body that is the same way, right? Like you have requirements and then if you get too much, your body gets out of balance. And I really try to avoid that word, like just do things in moderation and balance, because I think that it's abused a lot. But I don't know, it's kind of clicking for me that is something that is related to the inflammation, right? Like you can't go without, because then we see all these other health problems. But also, like, if that's the major source for your body, then you're going to create other problems as well. And so, I guess one of the things that I'm interested to learn more about is how that would affect the gut, because one of the things that we know and we've talked so much about is how your microbiome feed off of your little friends feed, they grow off of the food that you feed them.
Yeah.
And your bad friends like sugar and your good friends like fiber is kind of how it's been phrased. And that feels like diet culture too. So I'm curious what the science says and kind of like how we can reframe that thought process as well, if that makes sense.
No, for sure. I think one of the things that you emphasized is the idea of moderation. And I think both of us really dislike that everything in moderation phrase because um, it's used to rationalize typically poor choices in a way that is, not. It's still not a sort of balanced sort of mindset in terms of food, right? So it tends to not lend itself to understanding the best choices and then living our lives imperfectly within that framework. So I'm going to give you a different term that I really like. That's the science word for it, and it's a U-shaped curve. So most things in biology follow a U-shaped curve. And what that refers to is basically that there's this like happy medium, perfect Goldilocks zone in the middle where everything is awesome. And then if you have too little, something bad happens. But if you have too much, something bad happens. And that's exactly what we're talking about when it comes to sugar consumption and sort of carbohydrate consumption in general. That is yet another thing that falls under that U-shaped curve. So instead of going, oh, moderation, you can start saying U-shaped curve. It's super nerdy, but also it's kind of epic, I think.
I really love that concept. And it also reminds me of um, a talk that I heard from Chris Kresser a decade ago, which really stuck with me as well, which is also like that bell curve of um, where we are with kind of like it when your body is sick, what your body needs versus then when your body is well and what it needs, which I also
Mm-hmm.
hear you talking about a bit here, right? So it's
For sure.
all coming together for me. Let's talk a little bit about that Does it apply to the gut microbiome though? Like that same
Yeah,
kind of concept? Look at that
for sure.
science showing up
So
everywhere.
great. So what's really interesting to me is that this has only quite recently been studied. So how sugar impacts other biological processes has been studied in much greater depth than how sugar intake actually impacts gut microbiome composition. So looking at how it changes the balance in the gut microbiome, the diversity, and that the growth of like really important species or the growth of pathogens. And so I pulled, I think, three relatively interesting studies to talk about. The first was a 2017 study. And as a reminder to our listeners, we always put all of the links to the studies that we talk about in our show notes. So if you want to go read the actual study, that's there for you. And what they did was they fed rats for quite a long period of time, 4 months, which, in a 2-year lifespan is a really long time, a high-fat Western diet that either had 5% of the diet as added sucrose, table sugar, which is half glucose and half fructose, or 5% fructose, or their control. And then they looked at how that impacted, various metabolic markers, right? They were looking at things like weight gain, glucose intolerance. And then they also looked at the gut microbiome because there's a very strongly established link between gut microbiome composition and diabetes and obesity in a way that, I mean, they've done animal studies where they've driven, they've taken one group of mice and fed them what's called a Western diet. So it's basically a high fat, high refined carbohydrate diet, and made those mice obese. And then they've taken another group of mice and fed them a regular diet. And then they do what's called a fecal microbiota transplant. So they take basically the gut microbiome from the obese mice and give it to the healthy mice, and then the healthy mice gain weight. And so again, sort of in the context of what we've talked about on this show about obesity not being the health problem itself, but being a symptom that something else is out of whack. And reminding our listeners that we've already covered on the show that obesity is not synonymous with poor health, and that we on this show have a body positive approach. So we're focused on health behaviors, on healthy diet, and not on weight itself as a pathology. So keeping all of that sort of framework in mind here, seeing changes in the gut microbiome related to that confluence of high fat and sort of high refined carbohydrate intake with basically added sugars in the diet is really, really interesting because it is driving changes in the gut microbiome that are then impacting metabolism. So this is a way of sort of looking at what is the biological process behind this type of diet that can be leading to health problems like type 2 diabetes, like cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome. So what this study showed is basically a pretty big shift in the gut microbiome, whether they had sugar or fructose. But what was really interesting at a 5% of total diet level was that the change was actually more pronounced in the sucrose addition than the fructose addition. And that is sort of contrary to a lot of other studies that have shown that generally, fructose can be very problematic for the gut microbiome. And actually the next study that I pulled does sort of confirm fructose is more problematic, but we need to also remember dose as one of the sort of important parts of this study, because how much sugar versus how much fructose versus how much fat in the diet, they're all inputs to how that's impacting the gut microbiome. So in this study, they showed that there was a pretty big change in some really important probiotic species. And they showed that there was an increase in some sort of known problematic species. And so that was driven by the sort of confluence of high sugar intake, with sucrose being worse than fructose in this study, with a high fat diet. And also, these rats also became insulin resistant and obese, as sort of is expected when you put rodents on these types of diets. Another 2017 study, so published the same year, sort of a similar design, but what they did was they took, in this case, it was mice. They were, again, fed this sort of high-fat Western style diet, but then they either had regular water or they had water that was enriched with 30% fructose. So instead of looking at a study where the added sugars are like 5%, this was looking at added sugars. It was basically almost a third of their calories came from fructose. So interestingly, the animals that had the sugary water ate slightly less food, but their caloric intake was way higher. And what they looked at was not just changes in the gut microbiome, but also changes in the intestinal barrier function. So looking at leaky gut, and showed that that combination of a high fat Western style diet with a lot of calories from fructose, and 30% sounds like a lot, but it's actually sort of similar to sort of high fructose corn syrup sweetened beverage consumption in Americans, especially in teenagers. So it's not out of the sort of realm of what we're seeing in people. And what they showed was like really dramatic. So there was basically about a 3 times increase in a measurement of leaky gut. There was big changes to gut barrier, what's called morphology. So basically the structure. They showed that the mucus layer was much lower with this combination of high fat diet and a high fructose. Intestinal immune function, the immune barrier in the intestine, were reduced. Measures of the gut microbiome showed huge changes in the sort of balance between the 2 most dominant phyla of bacteria in the gut, which is a really well-established indicator of gut health. And they also showed that bifidobacterium, one of the most important genera of probiotic bacteria in the gut, were like 330 times lower when you added fructose, like crazy huge change. So this, again, it's a very different sort of experimental design because it's looking at higher fructose consumption compared to looking at sucrose versus fructose in a much lower proportion to the overall diet. And it when you start to kind of pull those threads together, you can sort of see that there's there's changes with lower consumption, but things get really dramatic with higher consumption. And the question always is, okay, rodent studies are fascinating. Rodent studies are really good for helping us sort of drill down into mechanisms. So it's a human studies, epidemiological studies show that there might be a link, but you can't say for sure that 2 things are linked until you understand mechanistically what's happening. What is the chemical reaction that is driving A to equal B? And so these types of studies really help to sort of show that. And gut microbiome studies are a lot harder to do on humans, but there has been one human study. This was published in 2010. And what they were actually trying to do in this study, they were comparing eating normal Cadbury chocolate. So basically, they had healthy young volunteers, and they just gave them chocolate to eat for 6 weeks, gradually increasing. So it was 50 grams a day for the first 2 weeks, 75 grams a day for the second 2 weeks, and then 100 grams a day for the last 2 weeks. And they were comparing regular sugary milk chocolate to chocolate made with about different kinds of sugar replacers. Again, this show is not talking about sweeteners, so we're kind of going to skip over that part of the study and just focus on what happened to sort of the control group that was consuming sugar. It's helpful to kind of understand like where this is in terms of intake, 100 grams of Cadbury milk chocolate has 56 grams of sugar in it, which is around 10%, a little bit over 10% of added sugar calories. So it's just slightly above. And again, there would probably be some added sugars in these volunteers' regular diet as well. So this is probably taking them well above that 10% added sugars rule, which we are going to dig into in detail pretty soon. And what was really interesting was that in this sugar group consuming chocolate, they had some changes in the gut microbiome that would be considered good and some that would be considered probably not great. But they had some really positive changes. So they had an increase in 2 different Ruminococcus species of bacteria that are important probiotics, and an increase in Faecalibacterium prausnitzii, which is one of the most important probiotic species in the gut. So fascinating. And then they also had an increase in 2 potential pathogens. They're normal residents of the gut, so they become pathogenic when they grow out of balance. So seeing an increase isn't great, but certainly the increase wasn't enough to be alarmed. Like, it wasn't causing problems in these people. And they had an increase in production of a short-chain fatty acid called butyrate. That is a product of normal bacterial metabolism that is associated with all kinds of health benefits. So high butyrate production is really great. So in the human study, where intake has kind of it's certainly higher than this 10% of added sugars cusp, but it's not the 30% diet from fructose, as in the mouse study. The changes in the gut microbiome overall were not alarming, and some of the changes were actually indicating something good happening. That's important to emphasize. That's probably not because of the sugar. It's probably because of the chocolate itself.
I was
So
just going to
cocoa is
ask.
beneficial. Yeah.
Yeah, because we've talked before about my desire for chocolate when I might have a magnesium deficiency, depletion. For example, it is a common craving for women who are about to get their period, which can deplete magnesium, and chocolate has magnesium. If our body is that intuitive, like, and it can be, right? Like, you can crave banana if you need potassium and different things. And so there's antioxidants, there's healthy fats, although I don't want to get into what kind of chocolate it was, but it's fascinating to me. Like, if someone had done this exact study on the same amount of sugars, but not with a food that had any nutritional benefits, like, I don't know, gummies that weren't made with gelatin, but you know what I mean? Like, what
Right.
the result might be. And it is interesting, I will say for myself, and I would encourage listeners to consider this, like, do you crave different kinds of sweets at different times? And what might that be telling you? I think one of the things that is interesting to me about intuitive eating, which is something we have talked on the show before. I did like a live panel. Was that last year? Time is very
Ooh,
weird
2
lately.
years? I don't
Yeah.
think I can time anymore. I don't think that's the
Yeah,
skill that's
no,
ever coming
yeah.
back.
And I'm like, that whole period of time is just lost now. But what was, it's something that I believe in passionately, trusting our bodies and listening to our bodies, but with the context that there are hyper palatable foods that can trick our bodies. And especially if your body is not in a place where it's healthy to give you the right cues to begin with, that can be problematic. And that is not something that's accepted by that movement. And that's the difficulty that I have with it, because when we look at the science and we can see, like, there is benefit to some of these things, but there's also foods that are out there that were created for the sole purpose of wanting you to just eat more and more and more of them, right? And can our brain and our bodies really compete with that, given that ours were created to indicate to us what we might need nutritionally, and some of these foods are void of nutrition. But we're moving on from that.
Well, I think it's worthwhile to emphasize that all 3 of these studies really help to draw a picture where it's not just about the sugar. So, for example, in that second mouse study, when they did a control diet with 30% fructose, they did not see those problematic changes in the gut microbiome. It was only that combination of high fat Western style diet and high fructose consumption, right? We saw in the human volunteers, oh, by the way, I totally volunteer for any study that just the only thing I have to do is eat chocolate every day and poop into a container a couple of times. That sounds great. Um, but they also, right, they were actually benefiting, even though that type of chocolate is fairly low cocoa, and it's cocoa and chocolate that is the beneficial compound. They still overall saw benefits to the gut microbiome, even though it was increasing their sugar intake. So what all of these kind of together show that the gut microbiome is a super complex ecosystem. We already knew that, and that it's not just about how much sugar, it's also about the phytonutrients, the vitamins, the minerals, the types of fats, right? Omega-3 fats and monounsaturated fats are really good for the gut microbiome. It's about the fiber content. All of those things are really, really important. And probably at the end of the day, if the rest of the diet is healthy, sugar is not, it doesn't look like sugar is going to have a big impact.
I like that summary. Um, and I do think that one of the things that kind of like resonates for me is that in your statement is that if the body is healthy, blah blah blah, right? And
Right.
having come from the history that we talked about last week, for me, I have found not to think about myself from the place of like, but I do all these things. I think that's one of the mentality things that's really difficult for a lot of people. And it sounds like maybe Grace might be feeling that too, right? Like, but I'm doing all these great things. Therefore, I'm going to say my body is, and I'm going to do whatever. Like, I've learned because of so many other things that we've talked about on the show, of things that have influenced my body's health that I didn't make conscious decisions of because I was a baby, or like different things like that, and then also going into the different health challenges and choices that I made when I was younger. I have to remember that that was the majority of my body's life, and that's
Yeah.
what it's like going to veer towards sometimes if I try to assume the best of my body. I have to also know my body's going to do what it falls back on. And so I'm glad we talked about that, but I want to be the first to kind of step up and say, like, that doesn't work for me. Like that, I think, I need to think of what are the choices that I'm making today affecting my body kind of every day. Like, I can't just for myself, I have learned, and this is all an N=1 equation, like, if I lean into something the way that a healthy person would be okay doing, and I'm using quotation marks when I say that, right? My body doesn't react the same way. Maybe because I'm those mice that was under the bad study for so long. And now, I'm still working towards needing to get away from that. And one of the things that I've realized, and I know we're going to talk about it, is when I prioritize nutrition sufficiency and proper sleep and hydration, those are the three things that like are really difficult for me personally. Somebody
Hmm.
else might have other things that they need to work on, but those are the three that fall away really quickly for me. And instead of telling myself I need to consume less sugar, if I tell myself I need to get more nutrients in, like I need to focus on consuming more nutrients, my body's desire in telling me to do these things because of its history and all these sort of things falls away so much easier. And I think to get to Grace's question, I can't suppose to tell Grace what to do or what not to do, but what ultimately I would be asking myself is like, why do I want that sugar every day? And not would be asking myself, I am
Hmm.
asking myself, let's be real, right? Like, why am I wanting that every day? And one of the reasons is because it's satiating some sort of form in my brain, but it's also like keeping me from being satiated in other ways with the nutrients that I need or the sleep that I'm getting. Like, I'm supplementing that same sort of release, the physical sufficiency in a different way, if that makes sense. So
It
maybe we can
totally
talk
makes
about that a little
sense.
bit. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that one of the the big concerns with how much more sugar, I mean, not just Americans, but Canadians, Europeans, basically like all Western countries, have sort of increased over the last 40-ish years. One of the big concerns with that is the displacement of more nutrient dense foods. Because when we consume sugar, generally, there are some exceptions. Generally, we're not getting a ton of important sort of vitamins, minerals, essential amino acids, essential fatty acids, phytonutrients in that food. Again, there are exceptions, and we'll kind of come back to that at the end. But that's been one of the main concerns and there have been studies that have basically looked at how nutrient intake goes down as sugar intake goes up. So in the context of the standard American diet, the types of things that dominate a grocery store, typically the more refined food is, the less nutritive value it has, but the more added sugars it's going to have. So that's one piece of the puzzle, but it's also helpful to sort of focus at least a little bit on the fact that processing high sugar intake can also deplete the body of some nutrients, 5 in particular that are well understood in terms of the mechanisms of how that links to high sugar intake. And Stacey, I think one of the things that you kind of mentioned tangentially that I think is sort of helpful to solidify a little bit for Grace and our listeners is that these are different mechanisms. So for somebody, depending on your genetics, depending on your lifestyle, depending on your hormone regulation, all of those things, the impact of sugar on your gut microbiome might be higher or lower, and the impact of that oxidant production relative to your body's antioxidant capacity might be higher or lower. And same with these nutrient deficiencies that can be driven by high sugar intake. So which mechanism is dominant can be highly variable person to person because there's all of these other different inputs into all of these different systems. So I think it's really helpful to kind of say it's not one or the other. It is that all of these things can be happening simultaneously to some degree. And that's where kind of going over that cusp of sugar intake that can be a little bit variable person to person. Some people will start to feel it and other people won't. So the nutrients that can be depleted by high sugar intake, vitamin D, this is specifically related to high fructose intake. So high intake of fructose increases the expression of an enzyme that degrades vitamin D, but also decreases the expression of an enzyme that's important for synthesizing vitamin D. And then because vitamin D is important for facilitating calcium absorption, that can have a downstream effect on calcium levels as well. So high fructose intake through that mechanism can lower vitamin D levels and calcium levels in the body. Magnesium is depleted very specifically with high sugar intake and elevated insulin. So it's very much that insulin sensitivity and high sugar intake. And so what happens in that case is it drives the kidneys to excrete more magnesium. So we end up depleting our stores of magnesium that way. Chromium is basically also excretion by the kidneys is increased in a high sugar diet. There was one study that showed that eating a diet of 35% simple sugars, which is quite high, but not out of the realm of what about 10% of Americans are consuming, that chromium excretion went from 10% at a normal level to 300%, which is a 30-fold increase. That's very, very big. And then the last nutrient that can be depleted from high sugar consumption is vitamin C. And that's because glucose and vitamin C actually use some of the same transporters to get into cells. So when we have high levels of glucose, it can basically slow down the absorption of vitamin C into our bodies. So those are all nutrients that our needs for them increase the more sugar we're consuming.
And also high stress, right? It's also, I think what I'm trying to wrap my brain the stress response to desiring the sugar is also depleting, for example, magnesium, right? So
Hmm.
it's like this
And
double
vitamin
hit.
C.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
it's like this double
Yeah.
hit.
So we I don't have the show numbers in front of me, but we've actually recently talked about vitamin C and the stress response, as well as all things magnesium, including its relation to the stress response. Those are the top two nutrients that are depleted, especially during chronic stress. And what's really interesting about this is that you're right, Stacey, the stress response does drive an increased appetite, but also a craving for energy dense food. So for some people, they'll crave more sugary foods. Other people will crave higher fat content foods. Some people will be both. And I know we've talked about it on the show before, but there have been some studies that show that consuming these energy dense foods can be somewhat neuroprotective, or at least protecting from some of the stress behaviors associated with chronic stress. They've studied this in rodents, and so there's something that the body's trying to do to protect itself with these cravings. The issue is when stress is sort of unrelenting and it never goes away. We end up really, driving these different biological processes that are overall inflammatory, right? They're increasing things like triglycerides in the serum, which is a cardiovascular disease risk factor. But your point about stress being part of this equation is spot on, because the stress response is so tied to nutrients, is so tied to appetite, is so tied to cravings, and can both drive increased sugar intake, but also magnify the problems associated with increased sugar intake. I'm Dr. Sarah Ballantyne, and my best resource for learning all the ins and outs of the autoimmune protocol within a rich and supportive learning environment is my 6-week online course called the AIP Lecture Series. And the next session starts Monday, September 13th, 2021.
I know you've been teaching this course for a long time and your students absolutely love it. Can I read some of those testimonies that you received from your last session?
Oh, sure, go for it.
Okay, Joy wrote, "You have impacted my life in such a great way. You are truly an inspiration. Your amazing research and phenomenal presentations of all your wisdom and knowledge has enlightened my world and has given me new hope. I am eternally grateful."
Aw.
And Heather wrote, "This has been an incredible class. Having been on AIP for a year and a half with the guidance of a dietitian who was well versed in the diet, I wasn't sure how much I would get out of it, but I have learned so much and I have refined my diet in multiple ways. Your answers in the chat are so thoughtful. The money was so worth it. Thank you. You are doing incredible work and I would recommend this class to others in a second."
I'm just so proud that this course is making such a big difference in people's lives. In this 6-week course, I teach the entire scientific foundation for both the diet and lifestyle tenets of the autoimmune protocol. And I provide tons of tips and strategies for implementation, refinement, troubleshooting, and mindset. And I also provide individualized guidance and support and connect with every single student within a private Facebook group for the course. And I personally answer every single question posed during every session. Today is the last day for early bird pricing, but our listeners can always use the code WHOLEVIEW, that's WHOLEVIEW, to get the best discount on the course available. You can learn more and enroll on my website, thepaleomom.com, or go directly to thepaleomom.com/go/AIPLS.
Okay, I think we've laid most of the groundwork, but I know one of the things that you've mentioned several times is this 10% when it comes to added sugars.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if there's science that you've dug into to see where that comes from. Is it supported? Is that something we should be doing? And listeners, when you hear me use the word should, there's always air quotes around that.
For sure. I actually found this science really interesting to dig into. I've been meaning to dive into it into greater detail for quite a while. So I really enjoyed the opportunity of Grace's question to do that. And looking at the sort of history of this limit of 10% added sugars in dietary guidelines, right? We see this pretty much globally now, the sort of 10% added sugar rule. And the original research that came to that 10% was looking at basically correlations with obesity. And we've already talked about how correlation does not equal causation, and obesity, can be more of a symptom than a pathology itself. And also the link to cavities, dental caries, as well as sort of the studies on nutrient deficiencies through displacement. But actually, since those became kind of like standard recommendations, there's been some really well-designed studies that have looked at how sugar intake links to cardiovascular disease. And that's actually the strongest evidence for that 10% rule. And so I pulled a couple of those studies to talk about. This first one was performed in 2014, and it was an NHANES study. So it's the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, which actually is a study that has provided tons of really valuable information looking at the links between diet, nutrition, nutrients, and health in general. And it's an American cohort. And so what they did was they divided that cohort between people who consumed less than 10% of sugars, between 10 and 25%, and then above 25% of their diet from added sugars. It's worthwhile to just define added sugars here. So added sugars are not like the sugars in fruit. That is not considered an added sugar. That is actually not part of this equation at all. Studies show that fruit consumption is strongly linked to health benefits, and that those sugars are not processed the same way as added sugars. So added sugars are things like high fructose corn syrup, or even just cane sugar that are added to a food during processing or preparation. So this is simple sugars. So that can include both natural sugars as well as highly processed sugars. And so what they found was, first of all, most adults consumed more than 10% of their calories from added sugars. It was 71.4%, and about 10% of adults consumed 25% or more. So that's one first important study. Like we're actually on average not below that 10% marker, which is really important. And they did this really sophisticated analysis of cardiovascular disease events that adjusted for age, sex, race and ethnicity, as well as sociodemographic, behavioral, clinical characteristics. So that's looking at things like smoking and activity, right? All of those different things were adjusted for. It was a really rigorous statistical analysis. And they showed that in those people who consumed between 10 and just under 25% of their diets from added sugars, they had a 30% increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And those that consumed more than 25% of their calories from added sugars had a 2.75-fold increase, a nearly 3 times increase in cardiovascular disease events. So you can see a modest effect between 10 and 25%, and a very big effect above 25% calories from added sugar. So that is a really strong case compared to the baseline, right? Under 10%. There was a really important 2016 study. This was done on a Swedish population, and they looked at, again, sort of that how much sugar they were consuming and how that linked to cardiovascular disease. And they actually showed that 15% was the cusp. So above 15% of calories from sugar, though that cohort had a 37% increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And so they were really looking at 15% as being the cusp. And I think that overall, when you kind of look at the scientific literature as a whole, 10% seems to be a really smart level. But you can kind of see, if you look at, right, the Swedish study looking at 15%, that again, the Swedish diet on average is more nutrient dense, right? So you can start to see that there are some other inputs here. There are on average a more active population. There's some other inputs here that are also a factor. So when everything else is dialed in and we're consuming a very nutrient dense diet, there may be more flexibility than just 10%. But 10% is, of a 2,000 calorie a day diet is 200 calories from sugar. That's a pretty great treat on a daily basis. Like that is lots of flexibility.
It's interesting to me. Can you say the percentage of people who was it over 70% are in the 25 or more percent? Is that what you said?
No, it was 10%. So it was 71.4% consumed more than 10% of calories from sugar. So but over 2/3, almost 3/4 of Americans consume more than that 10% of added sugars level. And 10% of Americans consumed more than a quarter of their calories from sugar.
I'm assuming, and we know what assumptions, but I'm thinking that has a lot to do also with soda, right? Like,
Yes.
yes.
Yes. So actually, sugar sweetened beverages, which is not just soda, but like sports drinks, any like fruit juice with added sugars, like those types of drinks, right? Fruit punches. I'm using air quotes, which is silly on a podcast, but I had air quotes around the word punches. All of those are actually the dominant source of added sugars in most people's diet. So something like 30 to 40% of the sugars in the typical American diet is just coming from beverages. And what's really interesting is sugar sweetened beverages have been shown to be problematic, not just because of the sugar, but they actually drive overeating. So there was a really interesting 2009 study where they looked at how how food intake changed when the size of a regular cola, for example, increased from 12 ounces to 18 ounces. Energy intake increased by 10% in women and by 26% in men. So having that sugar in a beverage with a meal, not even taking into account the added calories from the beverage, increased how much people ate. And this has been shown. There was actually a 2007 meta-analysis, which our regular listeners know is my favorite kind of scientific study, that looked at 88 different studies and basically showed that there was a stronger relationship between soft drink intake and health outcomes than any other kind of sugar intake. So basically, soft drinks were associated with higher energy intake, so eating more calories, and then also lower intake of other nutrients, so displacing calories, but probably also depleting important nutrients, and then also worsening health outcomes. So sugar sweetened beverages are definitely the biggest culprit here.
It is fascinating to me, but also not surprising at all that you'd consume more during a meal than with the beverage. This is another side tangent of things that like we've talked about, but maybe need to dive into. But one of the things that I remember hearing early on in my journey and really like sticking with me and making a difference in my digestion was the fact that a lot of people use the liquids that they drink at a mealtime to wash down food without properly chewing. And that in doing that, it prevents proper digestion, which then has all this ripple effect of like not being able to indicate when you're properly full, because part of the process is chewing, and that elongates the process also so that your hormones can come into play to tell you, oh, I'm full now. And if a beverage is sweet, I'm more likely to like want to keep going to have access to that sweetness as someone who
Interesting.
has a sweet tooth, right? So one of the things that I learned like early on is that I don't actually drink while I'm eating anymore. Like sometimes I'll take a few sips between bites if I feel like I need to clear, but I actually save my fluids for after a meal or well before a meal, but not like while I'm eating because it dilutes my digestion. As someone who's had low stomach acid from being vegetarian for so long and also doesn't have gallbladder, that has made a huge difference in my body's ability to digest. And I could totally see how that would increase calories and reduce digestion, which I'm sure is having all kinds of impact in other health areas, right? So it's like it's mind-blowing to me as I see all these things come together, the different ways that like one thing has this snowball effect on other things, right? Like
Yeah.
if you're stressed, look at all these things. Like then you eat more sugar, then you crave the soda, then you do this and then you do this, and it's like Americans are often looked at as so unhealthy. And again, those air quotes, and I said that. I don't know why I keep doing air quotes and you can't see them. Um, for our food choices, but one of the things that has been made very obvious to me is the American work culture is unlike any other culture too, right? And so when we look at how stressed Americans are because we work more hours than other cultures and we expect more of a family dynamic and like the different activities that we do and we're all running around, and it's like our culture is busy busy busy. What effect is that having on all of this that's coming out, so
Yeah.
it's full circle moment for me. I'm having all kinds of cathartic like fireworks coming out of my brains. If you could see the hand motions, that's what would be happening. But I do think that it's kind of fascinating to think about the beverages having that impact on the percentage, but that the majority of people, it seems, are between that like 10 and 25%. You found the study that's showing about 15% is the cutoff. Why do you think that science is kind of leaning in so much to 10 versus 15%? Do you think, I have many questions for you, good luck answering them all. Do you think if we parsed apart those studies to under 10, under 15, and then 15 and above versus 25 and above, that you would kind of like see different mechanisms or results that would be interesting? And also for those of us who don't count calories because we've had a history with eating disorders, is there a guide to follow that isn't potentially as triggering? Choose one of those questions and go.
Answer them all simultaneously. Go. So I think that right now the scientific consensus, or at least the majority of the scientific studies, would point to 10% being a better cutoff for most people than 15. But it's clearly not like going off a cliff, right? It's clearly not that 9.9% is good and 10.1% is bad. It's clearly a dose response. So the question is, when you look at those dose responses, there tends to be a spot where it's not a line, it's not a straight line. It tends to be this kind of like S-shaped curve. And so what you're trying to do is stay off of that steep incline, right? So you want to stay at the bottom of the curve and not at the top of the curve. So there suddenly becomes this range, and that range is probably in the 10 to 15 area, where all of a sudden the problems start to sort of like steeply increase. And I'm gesticulating wildly over here, but of course, again, audio medium, it's really just really just me getting a workout in. And so it would be very interesting to see a study that kind of goes like 0 to 5%, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, 15 to 20, etc. I haven't seen any study that's like that. It is worthwhile noting that the American Heart Association for a long time has actually stuck to half of that. So 5% of calories from added sugars is what they suggest for cardiovascular disease risk, even though these more recent studies show that 10% is adequate. And the World Health Organization's recommendations are limiting added calories to 10% with a goal being 5%. So I think that, we didn't go into in detail the research looking at cavities or the links to obesity. But I think that, where those recommendations come from is a more sort of comprehensive look at all of the different studies. I think that the 10% line is very, basically the level of scientific evidence for that is really high. I think higher than if we were going to draw that line at 15. But also, I think that, these studies taken all together really show that, like Grace, who is putting a lot of effort into a nutrient dense diet, the AIP also includes a focus on lifestyle. When everything is dialed in, again, like our metabolisms can be more flexible. We can handle a suboptimal sugar intake once in a while. So the idea is to kind of define an amount that's okay for daily intake, and then understand that sometimes we might consume more than that. And when we're doing everything right, that's probably going to be fine for us, but it's also really helpful to understand our own individual tolerance. So the other part of your question is like like counting calories is not ideal. How do we define 10 like how can we measure this in a way that is healthier? So for a 2,000 calorie a day diet, I know I'm defining how much to eat without calories by using calories. So just bear with me for a second. 10% of calories from added sugar would equate to about 12 and a half teaspoons of sugar per day. And, honey, molasses, they're all sort of maple syrup are all kind of equally sweet per teaspoon. It's a small difference. So, round down, say 10 teaspoons a day is probably a better level, especially, if you don't consume 2,000 calories a day. That's sort of 2,000 calories is kind of like usually in between what most women need and most men need, depending on your level of activity. So obviously, the more active you are, the more energy that you need to fuel that activity. But 10 teaspoons, like I think thinking of that as an amount per day, that's I mean, to me it sounds like if Grace is putting a little bit of honey into some herbal tea in the evenings or having a square of dark chocolate, she's making actually pretty reasonable choices in terms of getting that sweet taste and staying well below that 10 teaspoons per day kind of overall guide. And of course, the American Heart Association would rather us stay more like 6 teaspoons a day. So, taken all together, that kind of intake, especially when we're working at all of the other healthy behaviors, healthy diet, nutrivore, working on stress management, working on getting enough sleep, living an active lifestyle, the science as a whole shows us that that level of sugar intake is completely within our body's biological capacity to handle.
And I think that the other thing that I think of when you so nicely explained to Grace that she was making good choices, so I want to emphasize, good job, Grace. Um, I think the thing that we're taught is it's bad, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
and therefore we're bad for wanting anything sweet. And that is ultimately rooted in diet culture and this fear of fat phobia. But there's also this element that we do need to be aware of when it gets to be that snowball we can't control, like I
Yeah.
mentioned earlier. And that comes from the true fact that sugar can be addictive because
Yes.
of the hormones and the different kinds of things that can be triggered in your brain, not because you're a bad person, but because there is a physical reaction that is happening. And that's where that mindset that I asked, like, I would ask myself, why am I wanting so much sugar so often? Because there is a root cause to that that is fueling the addiction, just like there is a root cause for other addictions, right? It's not just alcohol presented itself and yada yada yada. You know what I mean? Like there are things that
Oh, what's this wine doing in my hand?
oh God, I don't want to belittle that.
No,
It is
but
an
it is
addiction.
true. Yeah,
Yes.
no,
Yeah.
100%. And I think that's a really sort of great place to kind of wrap up all of the science is to kind of acknowledge that sugar addiction is real. We've talked about mindset around sweets and treats and indulgences several times on the show. Episodes 300 and 323 are probably our most sort of rigorous shows in terms of strategies for handling sugar cravings, but also the mindset around treats. But I think that it's helpful to also understand that there's a link between addictive behaviors and sleep and stress as well. So inadequate sleep definitely increases susceptibility, not just to you know, something like alcoholism or drug addiction, but also to food addiction and binge eating disorder. High chronic stress does the same. We've already talked on the show about sort of the link between appetite and cravings being strongly linked to stress. So in that case, it's really helpful to sort of take a step back and look at you know, whole behaviors, right? So when Grace's kids have candy, is it because candy's delicious and it's sort of a opportunistic sugar consumption, or is there a sort of maladaptive coping mechanism to stress going on there? And that's a really hard thing to sometimes have self-awareness about, but that can be a really helpful sort of self-exploration to go through. And in that case, you know, I really think that dark chocolate can be a really wonderful way to kind of satisfy a sweet tooth with a lot of nutrients, something that's really good for the gut microbiome and not drive sugar intake too high. But also fruit. I think we briefly mentioned that fruit is a very healthy carbohydrate source. Studies show that the maximum health benefits are around 300 grams of fruit per day. That's, depending on the fruit, 2 to 3 servings. But fruit intake doesn't start to increase all-cause mortality above at least 500 or 600 grams per day. So there's a lot of that U is very wide. So that U sort of optimizes around 300 grams, but you know, fruit is super healthy. We shouldn't be demonizing it as nature's candy. And fruit can be a really wonderful food to you know, have in abundance to help deal with that sweet tooth. So one of the things that I do when I fall off the sugar wagon, because it happens, especially with stress, and then it derails my sleep, and then it becomes, again, the snowball of badness. Fruit becomes my transition. So I give myself permission to eat as much fruit as I want. And I do not worry about eating 8 pieces of fruit in a day in order to take that step away from sugar, like legit high sugar foods. And fruit's loaded with really good fiber. It's great for the gut microbiome. It has lots of vitamins. Like, fruit's a nutrient dense food. And so fruit is not something that we should be feeling guilty about or putting under this added sugar umbrella. It does not go there. It goes into its own food group of awesome. Fruit is a health promoting food. So just kind of wanting to wrap up with acknowledging sugar addiction and the mindset around treats as being also really important, and thinking about other ways to satisfy that sweet tooth that are healthy choices.
I love the idea of fruit and chocolate, and I think it's difficult to have any sort of food addiction because you can't just stop eating, right?
Yeah.
And these challenges, they come, they go, but what we can do is provide the information on the science and just remember to give ourselves grace as we work through these things, to not shame ourselves or whatever, but also to understand that by completely eliminating sugar or carbohydrates, I can speak, we create more challenges for our body in not a great way, right? It's not like alcohol in that sense. Like, we can't just entirely give it up because then it's not as great for our body. So I love the idea of having a go-to, right? Like, if you're feeling a certain sort of way and you're trying to get yourself to a healthy place, knowing that fruit is something that you can just lean on heavily is great. I love solving problems, and that is a solution. So I know that we're going to have a follow-up to this because, as a listener, I want to have a follow-up to it. And I even suggested to Sarah that this is a 2-part show in and of itself, and she was insistent that we could get through. So congratulations to you for getting through. And if you do have questions or things that you want to discuss related to this, I want to remind you that we have a Patreon. We're going to have a follow-up discussion on this there, but also if you're part of our Patreon fam, you can submit those questions to be prioritized for us to see them. We get a lot of questions generally to our mailbox and social media, and we can't possibly answer them all, but we do prioritize making sure that we're getting through those Patreon ones and following up one-on-one with you. So thank you so much for making it this far, and we promise that we will have more on this because it is a can of worms that Sarah has opened, and now she must deal with as everything crawls out. She's going to have to wrangle it. But I was waiting for you to say.
Oh, I dropped the ball.
I know. I was like, I don't know what else to say now. Oh.
Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week. We love providing the Whole View podcast for you as a free resource. You can support the show by using the links and codes we share in our podcast. And we love to read your reviews and chats wherever you listen. And don't forget to share our podcast with your friends and family.
Speaking of chat, did you know that you can get exclusive behind-the-scenes content on Patreon? When you support us with your Patreon membership, you get access to live Q&As and weekly bonus audio. But they're not for kids' ears because our bonus content is explicit. You can also stay in touch with us via our social media channels. I'm at Real Everything Blog.
And I'm at The Paleo Mom. And we've got more great resources on our websites and in our newsletters.